Half year ago. You joined it, right?
Whew, all right. Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I'm glad my parents got to come, so. Yeah, thanks for helping
You're welcome.
get the delay. Yeah.
No problem. So when you talk, try to maybe still stay in the center so Goran can give you some memory of your presentation.
Okay.
And then all those names, right? Yeah, there you go.
Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Today is my great honor to chair the session for Daniel's thesis defense. So I'm very proud to present Daniel Weller. As everybody know him, he is a very charming person in the department, knows every single instrument, happy to talk to everyone about anything, including life, sports. Today, the topic is a little bit different. As you can see, he's going to defend talking about copolymer self-assembly property and application, and which I'm very excited about. Daniel has been very productive in my group. I'm very proud of his accomplishments. You know, when I joined the school in 2017, he was one of the first 2 students joining me. As you can see, it's like open business there. You are very much by yourself, and I thank you putting all your trust in me. You know, 4.5 years passed. I think we're doing pretty well, right? I hope you see that some of those trusts are well paid off with your accomplishment here. You have authored 3 publications, 1 to be submitted actually later this week. Again, with the ExxonMobil or with the first author, you also co-authored 2 additional publications, both single, very respectable polymer journals. You have attended multiple presentations, which all of them are very proud of you. And he and I also enjoyed several business trips together, which let me see Daniel better in a personal side. And of course, he has several rumors now going on. For example, one famous one, backup advisor is Dr. Gu is the best driver for the department.
You're welcome. Yeah.
Yes. So I am very impressed for several characteristics of Daniel. He is very persistent. He had worked on 2 projects, and one of them, as we will see in a moment, is about block copolymer self-assembly for rubbery material for tire, and this has to be bring acknowledgement to Dr. Sarah Morgan and Dr. Rob Story for linking us to with ExxonMobil. So we're going to hear about his talk on that, and we also have another part talk about block copolymer membrane, which he has been charging that effort. He was the first student on that, and he started all these efforts all by himself, which I'm very proud to hear again.
Yes.
With that, I want to hand over the floor to you, and good luck with your defense.
Okay.
Daniel?
Yeah, appreciate it. Yeah. Wow, it's finally here, so I'm excited to show you my research. And before I start, I should thank Dr. Gu. I was his first student, and I learned a lot from him. And I did get quite a few little stories from our trips. One of them was about just being an optimist and how important that is. And that's one of the things I'm going to take away from knowing him, is that when things don't work, you need to believe that they'll work. And he seems to have just this way of willing things to happen. And one of those was that we were trying to, at one of the synchrotrons, we were trying to stay as late as possible to do as many experiments, of course, and we were just leaving 0 time at all to get through all the San Francisco traffic and all this security, and he just was confident the whole time we're going to make it. I was a pessimist, and ultimately we got there, the flight was delayed, we were able to skip the entire line and show up with 15 minutes in time to get a beer before the flight. So it was, I learned a lot from you, and I appreciate everything. Also, Dr. Morgan's going to be leaving potentially early, so I'd just like to thank you as well. Great mentor. Loved your design of experiments class, and I really enjoyed working with you. Okay, so on to the topic of today, which is copolymer self-assembly, properties, and applications. Now, this is a pretty broad topic, and I kind of had to make it broad because kind of coincidentally, I ended up working on 2 projects, and I had to find the thread that's common between them. So one, I was looking at soft materials with hard domains in them, and the other one were these hard domains with soft materials, and all of these were copolymers I'm going to be talking about today. So I feel like it's a fairly reasonable way to tie this all together to a thesis. And what we're looking at is we're looking at how they self-assemble, how they phase separate, and how their morphology changes their properties, as well as what we can use them for in the field and how they can be applied. So we'll start from the beginning, what a copolymer is. Often, we're all pretty familiar with a homopolymer, traditional plastic. It's got kind of one type of property, but oftentimes, if you don't want to make a brand new polymer, you want some different properties in it. You might think, well, we can blend maybe 2 polymers together, and we can get some sort of combination of maybe thermal properties or that type of thing. When you blend polymers together, however, they often have a tendency to phase separate, and if you make a blend, they can macro phase separate, I mean large domains of phase separation. You can see here there's this white line that kind of bisects them. That's because they're really weak at the interface, because you don't have polymer chains that cross over into other domains. So another way that you can kind of combine polymers to get properties of both is by making some sort of copolymer, where you take monomers of 2 distinct monomers and you copolymerize them together. So every chain has kind of aspects of each polymer within it. And these, depending on how you do it, can take a blend of both properties if they're well mixed, or in certain cases, they can microphase separate, meaning that you get some properties of one material in one area and other properties of the other material in another. And so this creates a composite type material, which can lead to some synergistic effects where you get better properties than just a blend by itself. And this is mostly kind of determined by your chain architecture. So how your monomers are kind of added. So you can see here, the most simplest one is alternating, where you have monomer A, monomer B, and so forth. Statistical, where it's kind of more randomly assigned based on how fast they react. And then you can go down. But what I'm going to be spending most of the time talking about today is the blocky type of polymers. The polymers that have large runs of a single polymer, but they're still connected to the other comonomer. And we're going to be focusing on these because the blockier this chain architecture is, the more likely it is to phase separate rather than to become miscible in each other. So this is ABS. It's probably the most famous copolymer, most successful commercially. It's used to make Legos, and it's useful because it's very rigid and it has great dimensional stability, but it's also very tough. And without this microphase separation that's going on, it wouldn't be able to have both those types of properties. This is showing the SEM image after it's been stretched, and you can see the dark domains are actually the soft butadiene parts, and the light are the acrylonitrile styrene. They're kind of rigid, but also brittle. And as you stretch it, it creates cracks, but every time one of these cracks will run into your soft material, it'll arrest the crack, and so you no longer have failure of your material. So it makes it considerably tougher. I'll also be talking about, for the second half, actually for the first half, the opposite, where you can have a soft polymer with hard domains in the middle. And this is useful in applications for rubbers, and Kraton, or styrene butadiene styrene, is a very popular example of this, used for bike grips, all sorts of materials. So we're going to focus in on just block copolymers. And even within the chain architectures, just looking at block copolymers, there's quite a lot of ways that you can change their properties. For instance, you can change the number of blocks you have, which will have a great deal of impact on their strength. You can change the degree of polymerization, or how long these chains are, which will have impact on the size of your domains. You could also change the volume fraction, meaning the ratio of one monomer to another, which will change the geometry of the domains that they make. And also the interaction parameter, chi, which is how strongly they desire these monomers to phase separate. And by changing these, you get quite a bit different properties of your polymers. The kind of traditional, most simplest polymer that we're going to talk about is the linear diblock copolymer. Just 2 monomers. And if they have a tendency to phase separate, they will form very unique structures. You can see going from, as you change the volume fraction and you increase the minor volume fraction from around 10% to 30% to 50%. You go through spherical, cylindrical, gyroidal, and lamellar, all these phases. And this has been well kind of shown in research to follow these kind of parameters. It's a factor, it really depends on the volume fraction, but also as well as your interaction parameter and your degree of polymerization. So what can you do with these linear diblock copolymers? Well, these are two SEM images I've taken of some of our polymers. So you could get these features that are actually on the size scale of about 30 nanometers. You can even go lower with these. You can get features as low as 5 nanometers up to around 50 nanometers is common. And that's very small and useful for a lot of applications such as lithography or patterning, as well as you'll see later, using them for membranes. Because they're so small, you can filter out smaller species of things. I'm also going to be talking about elastomers, and one of these block copolymers, if you have 3 blocks rather than 2, it's potential that you can make a thermoplastic elastomer. In this case, SBS is styrene, butadiene, styrene. You see we have got these styrene kind of aggregates that are these hard domains. And within these, each chain, you've got a styrene block, and then you've got this soft rubbery block and another styrene block. So if you kind of choose any chain, you can actually connect to any other chain on this by going through what ends up being these crosslinks. And that's pretty useful for a couple reasons. Firstly, because traditional rubbers use chemical crosslinks, so you can't break these bonds. So that means that they're not going to be recyclable, and that they're also going to be difficult to injection mold. So these are fully recyclable and easy to melt and reprocess. So that's the background. Now I'm going to talk to you about what the overview of research. First of all, we're going to be looking at work with rubbers, looking at a natural rubber replacement. We ended up making what we believe to be a multi-block copolymer, lots of little hard blocks within this soft major domain. And also high efficiency membranes, where we take advantage of linear diblock copolymers to phase separate and self-assemble into structures that can be then turned into porous materials for filtration. So let's first move on to the natural rubber replacement. So natural rubber is an incredible material. It's really actually not been matched by synthetic rubbers before. SBR is kind of, or styrene butadiene rubber is kind of the closest it gets to properties. But you can see that the natural rubber is superior in terms of mechanical properties. So that means that it's useful and it's exclusively used in aircraft tires and in some large truck tires as well. So it's an important resource that we have. It's also renewable, which is great. It's got some disadvantage, however, and the biggest one is that it really only grows near the equator, meaning that we can't grow it as in the United States. It also only comes from basically one species of tree, which leaves it pretty, it makes it possible that infection or something like that could wipe it out. So there's often, you see natural rubber shortages that need to be addressed. So we wanted to look at trying to find something that could potentially take its place for specifically tires. Yeah. So elastomers kind of get their strength from actually entropy. So if you look at this here, we're showing all these different polymer chains, and they happen to have these crosslinks, which is traditionally done by sulfur, that will chemically bond each chain to one another. And when they are chemically bonded, that kind of mess of polymers is actually its preferred structure. So when you stretch it away from that, it's going to want to return there. And as you stretch it, all your chains that are soft and mobile will extend, but you lose entropy because there's no longer any more conformations. There's not as many conformations that each chain could take. So you have this returning force of stress. The crosslinks are vital to this because without crosslinks, as you stretch it, all the polymer chains would rearrange and they would never find their original chain structure again. And something interesting with elastomers that happens that actually increases their properties considerably in terms of their fatigue and tear resistance is that as you stretch them, the chains can become so aligned that you get crystalline formation, where you get your chains, the barrier of entropy has been reduced because you already stretched them out, and they can actually crystallize at room temperature. And each one of these crystallites will strengthen its material. So your tires can be strong when they need it, and they can be soft when you're not using them. So the material we're going to talk about today is this polypentanomer here. If you compare it to the chemical structure of natural rubber, they're actually somewhat similar. They've each got 5 carbons in the repeating unit, and they both have a double bond. There's just a little bit different structure. So chemically speaking, they're pretty similar. Thermally speaking, they're very similar. You can get equivalent thermal properties. So this is what in the maybe 60s people were looking at as possible for natural rubber replacement. They thought this because not only is it great thermal properties, it also undergoes strain-reduced crystallization. And it even has some benefits above natural rubber, and specifically that it can have it can hold a lot more filler. So a lot of the reason your tires are black is because it's mostly carbon, and this material can actually hold more carbon. So it means that you're going to use less polymer overall, and also potentially better mechanical properties. So that was kind of why this material was attractive. The problem is really that if you compare it to natural rubber, it's got still the problem that's a weaker mechanical strength. So with Exxon's help, we started looking at could we strengthen these materials by copolymerizing with something. I have to thank Dr. Carlos Lopez Barron. Carlos was really my mentor for a lot of the Exxon work I was doing. Taught me a lot about the elastomer research. And it really wouldn't have been possible without him. So thank you to him. This was also partly his project as well that I was kind of performing with him. So this is the experiment. First, we're going to do a control. This is linear polypentanomer. This is what you get normally. And then we're going to add some hard polymer throughout the segments. And then we're going to compare them and see how we can change the mechanical properties. We first are going to do this in the uncured state, so no cross-links at all before we add the sulfur. And then afterwards, we'll add the sulfur in and see if those properties combine to create something useful. Okay. So the synthesis of this, I did not do it all. So thank you to Sumant, Kyle, and Alex from Exxon. But in case you're curious about the synthesis, it's done with a tungsten catalyst, and it's a ring opening polymerization. And we can create polypentanomer. Also, if we add in this dicyclopentadiene, we get this structure where we have the double ring opening events where we get this kind of branch structure, but more importantly for today's talk, we get this really high TG segment. And this is going to be where we get our hard domains. So to do the experiment, we first synthesize, I didn't, but other people synthesized a lot of polymers, and each one with different DCBD content, so we could see the effect that DCBD had on different properties. We tried to keep the cis-trans content ratio, because that has a big effect on thermal properties, as well as the molecular weight as close as we could. And then we're going to look at how it affects the tensile properties, the morphology, the viscoelasticity, as well as their thermal properties. So the most interesting one is probably the tensile properties. We could melt press these into plaques and cut them in tensile bars, and we can measure what the stress-strain response is. So this black curve here is without any DCBD content. This is the linear. Keep in mind these are uncured, so it's reasonable that you have no strength in these materials. But as you increase the DCBD content, you see that you get stronger and stronger materials. And actually, if you zoom in on just this very sliver where you have the beginning, you can see a nice trend in the modulus. So if you look at the modulus during these first 2% strain, you've got this nice curve going on here. So we see really good results, so at least it makes sense for how much we add DCBD and what its effects are on the properties. And it's making it making it stronger and making it stiffer. One of those, the 6.6 mol % DCBD, was our highest performing, and so we started doing these cyclical experiments where we stretch and then we recover, we stretch a second time and recover again. And there's actually a considerable amount of recovery in these uncross-linked materials, which is really something that is suggesting that we have physical cross-link going on and that this is a thermoplastic elastomer. So we believe that the DCBD units are finding each other and they're phase separating. And because they're high TG, they act as physical cross-links that create this network that has elasticity. The biggest evidence from this is AFM. As you increase your DCBD content, you get more and more hard domains. So this is the first evidence and pretty clear that this could be happening. If you look at the mechanical properties, you can look at the viscoelasticity. On the bottom here, this is how fast we're measuring it. So on the right side, we're giving it the strain very quickly. On the left-hand side, it's very slow movements. And so they probe different kind of movements of your chains. And the one I want to talk to you about is the dark lines, this storage modulus. If you look at the no DCBD content, at really high strains or strain rates, it's very elastic material. But as you strain it slower and slower, it becomes more viscous, more liquid-like as you strain it slower. When we increase DCBD content, we see that even at low strain rates, we get elastic behavior. And actually, if you look at the tan delta, you can see that the crossover point, which is the point where your material becomes more liquid versus more solid, was never reached by our highest DCBD content elastomers, meaning that no matter how slow we stretch these things, they were still solid behaving. This is indicating that our DCBD is restricting our chain mobility. So because the physical crosslinks are there, the chains can't move past each other and flow like a liquid could. You can also see this in the DSC results. The DSC showed that we have these crystalline peaks here. So as we heat and cool this, we can see that our material will cool and create this peak. The first peak that comes up is the DCBD with 0%. And you can see that actually our highest content DCBD never crystallized at all. And if you look at the TG and the thermal properties, there's really nice trends again, where our TG is increasing because you need higher temperatures so you can get the mobility before your chains have mobility to move. And our melting temperatures and our crystallization temperatures are decreasing linearly because the chain mobility is also hindered. So this restricted chain movement is really frustrating the thermal transitions. So taking that knowledge, we then wanted to move into what would be more like a tire. So we took these materials and then we put them through a vulcanization process similar to what Exxon uses for their tires. And that's what's represented by these sulfur chains here. So now we're in the cross-link state. Similar sulfur content, similar most attributes. And this is what happened to the strength. So in red, we have our copolymer during stretch and retract, and it seems to be about 3 times stronger than the linear polymer. It's not all good though. One of the problems with this material is, especially during the retraction process, you can see that there's a huge amount of hysteresis. And so if you're talking purely for rubber properties or applications, that's not a good thing. And that's also a side effect of having restricted chain movements. So we can also, besides just stretching it, we can show this in other ways. And another way to do that is with X-ray. While we stretch it, we can actually see what the chains are doing by using this machine here. This is a really small machine, 1 centimeter. So it's this miniaturized tensile machine. It also can heat and cool your sample and tell you the stress strain curve. And we actually have this here. So if you have experiments that you want to do similar to this, I would talk to Dr. Gu. It's a really great instrument. As you can tell, we're going to need to fit this inside our X-ray machine. And we can monitor what the chains are doing right here as it's being stretched. So during the stretch, during retract, we can then shoot it with X-rays, and X-rays will tell us things like how much strain-induced crystallinity we have and how much our amorphous alignment or chain alignment is going on. This is what you're going to get out of your X-ray. So you end up getting this 2D data. It looks like this. And how do you get any information out of this? Well, first, if you're looking for crystallinity, you can see that there's these kind of high intensity peaks over here. These are your crystalline peaks. And the distance away from your beam center is how large these crystalline domains are. So you can take a little section and you can integrate all the intensity, this Q distance away from the beam center. And you can do that many, many times, integrating each one of these semicircles. And you can plot it as a 1D plot. And now you can see that we've got this one really large peak, which is all of our amorphous chains. And then we've got these crystalline peaks, which are really sharp. And we can plot these at all the steps throughout our stretching and retraction. And we can see that our copolymer has much slower strain-induced crystallization than our homopolymer, which our homopolymer around about 100% strain, it strain-induced crystallizes very quickly, whereas our copolymer has a much broader, longer, slower crystallization process, which is great to look at. But if you wanted to get down into the actual numbers, how crystalline, you can actually take the first, you could take these peaks that we get from the 1D plot, and you can separate them into constituent parts, the crystalline peaks and the amorphous peak. And by comparing kind of what percentage of scattering comes from your crystalline domains, you can get a number and take all this data and relate it down to just one number, which is percent crystallinity. And we were able to do that for each one of these 1D plots. And we could show that crystalline domains for our homopolymer, our strain-induced crystallinity is higher than, and also has a much faster rate of crystallinity compared to our copolymer, which is kind of more linear. Ultimately, our strain-induced crystallization was reduced by about 20%. There's extra information in this in these 2D plots that we didn't talk about. Before we were integrating this entire area, you can see that there's on the sides much more higher intensity. That's because those are representing the chains that are aligned with the stretch direction. And up here in the center is representing the chains that are aligned perpendicular to your stretch direction. So by looking at the angle and plotting inverse angle, we can see that we can start to measure what the, how aligned your amorphous regions are, or depending if we look at the crystalline region, how aligned your crystalline region is. There's an equation that we can just assign a single number to these things. But if you look at the alignment factor is what we call it. Alignment factor of 0 means that it's random. You got chains going all directions evenly. And alignment factor of 1 means that all chains are aligned with stretch. And so you can see again that as you hit this strain-induced crystallization, there's this extreme jump very fast in the homopolymer, whereas much more linear in the copolymer. Looking at the amorphous alignment, we also see that right around the same part where we have a jump in strain-induced crystallization, we have amorphous alignment that's also aligning. So we think that as these crystallize, they drag amorphous chains into alignment as well, if in the homopolymer, but in the copolymer, the restricted chains can't do that. So you can look at all this together, and you can see there's kind of 3 regions. One, before any strain-induced crystallization happens. Secondly, where there's very fast strain-induced crystallization, and third, where there's slower. But in the copolymer, there's really only 2. There's pre-strain-induced crystallization and post. And this is really what we believe just because the reduction in the, there's no real chance for stress relaxation in the copolymer. So that is, in conclusion with this project, to wrap it up. Basically, we showed that DCBD definitely increases the tensile strength considerably. This is our natural rubber here, actually, that I showed earlier. So outperforms natural rubber if this was the only way you were going to judge it by, just tensile strength on tension. Then you've got, we showed that chain mobility is hindering the crystallization. And finally, that the cause of all this is really that there's aggregation of these hard domains that are creating these physical crosslinks, making a more difficult to rearrange system of polymers. And with that, I'm going to switch gears a little bit to the next section. And I know that was kind of a lot to take in. So I have a brief intermission. This is, a lot of what you're going to see on these next few slides are SEM images. And so thank you, Dr. Rollins, for letting me use your SEM. It's been critical to my work here. And one of the first weeks I think I was trained on it, I found a butterfly outside that had died in the heat. And so I took a piece of its wing and sputter coated it in silver and then looked at it because I heard that they would look really cool under SEM, and they do. So this is kind of from the wings. You see some interesting structures. Zoom in further and further and further and further, and you get all these different unique patterns. And I used to, at NRT, I had to give tours to all these little kids, and when I got to SEM, I had to show them something nice. These actually look better, more interesting than all of my polymers, so I'd show them the butterfly photos. And then there was always a kid that would ask, like, what does this have to do with polymers? And I'd say, shut up, Tommy. Just enjoy the pictures. And for you guys, though, I'll try and make a connection. The structures that we have here, you can see really large structures going to really small structures. And it's going to be, you're going to see the similarities between the work I do with these composite membranes. And just for reference, this tiny red dot is the size of one of our pores. It's 30 nanometers. So it's very small. And yeah, you'll see. So this is our idea, this high efficiency ultrafiltration membrane. This was a lot of my PhD work, and I liked it because you could potentially make a big difference in the world doing lots of things. This is the size, this ultrafiltration membrane. It's the size where there's protein filtration, you can do wastewater recovery, and also like dialysis to filter blood as well. So it's a really important size scale to have high efficiency membranes. In this case, we're using a block copolymer that looks similar to this. And it's the opposite of what we were doing before with the rubber. So this is the real motivation. The efficiency of these membranes, there's a trade-off between how selective it can be and how permeable it can be. And there's actually a theoretical upper limit that's based on some of the equations that govern these things. And if you plot the kind of polymers and the membranes that are made and sold commercially, they kind of follow this trend. This is all based on the assumption that all of your pores have this log normal distribution. And block copolymers have the potential to break this limit because all of their pores are the same size. So that's really what attracted to us about this. And if you were able to have more efficient membranes, this would really make a big deal in the people's lives for wastewater recovery, for food, for energy creation. Really, it would make quite a big difference. So it's important work. This is the type of membrane that this model was based off of. It's used in most applications. It's called non-solvent-induced phase separation. And it's got this random pore structure. It's very easy to make, and it's been used since the 1960s. People knew that these isoporous membranes would be good in the 80s, and it's just difficult to make. So the first way they made it was actually by shooting radiation at polycarbonate. And then because of the isotope size, they would make these really uniform holes, but they're very dispersed holes, and so you don't get high flux. So it's good selectivity but low flux. Then block copolymers came on into the membrane world maybe 10 or 20 years ago, and people started looking at, well, these holes are perfectly sized. Maybe we can make these into membranes. And not only are they going to be the same size, but they're also going to be very neatly and densely packed. And so we can get high performance membranes. The problem is that it never really took off commercially. This is $1.50 for a gram if you buy it from Sigma. This is $500 a gram. So it's quite a bit more expensive. And oftentimes people will prefer to go for the cheaper route. So this is not our idea, but composite membranes have been thought that this could be a great way. The idea is that you use this very thin block copolymer layer on top of a thick, inexpensive macropore support. The block copolymer provides the performance, and the support provides the mechanical strength necessary. This is about 3 cents to cover a 25 millimeter diameter. So because it's so thin, you just really don't use that much block copolymer. You can withstand the high cost. This has been done by some pretty big groups. My academic grandfather, Tom Russell, he was one of the early adopters. He did some work on this, and the way he did it was creating these block copolymers here and then lifting off by hand. This is HF, you can't see. So pretty nasty solvent. Then doing some etching to remove one of the blocks and finally filter it. Then some other big names, Mark Hillmeyer came along, and this is just a small snippet. There's been a lot of people who worked on this. He found out that you can actually cast the block copolymer on top of your PES support if you fill it with water. So he kind of came up with that idea. And It's great. The cost of these is now kind of pretty reasonable. It's just that this hand type of making things and this slow process of removing the block copolymer that you're trying to make your pores with is not very scalable. And so turning this into a commercial product is difficult. So that's our goal for this project, is to look at how we can make techniques and methods to make something that could eventually be roll-to-roll printed like a newspaper, where we have something, cast our block copolymer on top, and turn it into a working filtering membrane by the end of it. Obvious benefits is it's going to make it more commercially relevant. And the challenges that we focused on, one was roll-to-roll annealing, making these things self-assemble. It's one of my chapters in my defense, but I'm not going to be discussing it today. And secondly is roll-to-roll pore formation. Like, how do we turn these domains into actual holes that things could pass through? So the way we started manufacturing these membranes to test is with our PES support. This is what it looks like. Then we would fill it with water. And then on top of the water surface, our toluene solution would then be spun coat. And we get this type of polymer. This is what it looks like under SEM before anything is done to it to create pores. So I know it looks like there's pores here. It's actually a dense membrane. You can see this is a cross-section. So we broke this under cryofracturing, put it on SEM sideways. You can see that this top surface is our block copolymer layer. The zoom in of it shown here. It's about 100 nanometers thin, so very thin layer of block copolymer. And then we have this very thick PES macropore support here. This membrane, as we made it, first of all, if we did the filtering process on it, it would have zero flow. It would, and it's because these aren't holes. It's actually a dense membrane. So we need to figure out how we can make pores or holes quickly. And we wanted to avoid doing the slow etching processes that was done before, because that's difficult to do roll-to-roll printing on. So we kind of took an idea from what's used in Gore-Tex and other materials, is you can stretch these things and maybe we can create pores that way. So Gore-Tex, I'm sure you're all familiar with, is expanded polytetrafluoroethylene. It's got crystalline domains and amorphous domains. And the amorphous domains are considerably softer. And so as you stretch these, you can create pores. These are pretty large pores. These would be considered macroporous rather than, or microporous rather than nanoporous. And like I said, it's these soft domains that are kind of the ones that form these holes. We were wondering, we've got block copolymers that have these soft domains, if we choose it to be. Could we use this to guide our cavitation processes so we can create smaller holes than the Gore-Tex could? So to start, we just use these extension stages, and each one you can program to move at a certain speed, and we could take our cast film, our composite film, and stretch them, and we see that before we stretch, there's no holes. As we stretch, we start to see these kind of cracks, or we call them crazes, where we have, these are permeable, things can flow through them. This is impermeable. And if you zoom out, you see that they look white from a distance, and that's due to a charging effect on the SEM. It actually makes it useful to see where how much coverage of holes you have. And we go to 20%, and we've got these nice elongated pores, and we're covering a fair bit of the membrane now. So we thought this seems to be a decent way to make pores. It's very fast as well. And we first looked at what's the size of these pores, what does strain do for it. Using ImageJ, we can look at, we use the software to kind of look at the differences in color or in brightness on this image, and a machine learning algorithm could show us where exactly these pores were. And then we can make these plots and see that all of our different pore widths and how many are shown. And we see this kind of trend where our pore widths kind of remain around 20 to 40. And it doesn't really matter if it's 10% or 20% strain. And our pore lengths increase. And we can also do the same thing with how much coverage we have. What percentage of our membrane is covered by these crazes? And we saw that our pore width, which is what we expect to be, which is actually the parameter that's going to be blocking out certain things, is remaining pretty much the same. And our craze coverage, the number of pores we're having, is increasing dramatically. So straining these things seems like the further you go, the more efficient membranes should be without losing selectivity. To test these, we have to test how permeable it is, how fast something flows through it, and also how well it rejects things. So to test the permeability, we take the dead-end filtration cell. We put 0.2 bar, and we measure how fast water will flow through this. And we have a scale that's attached to a computer to monitor the weight over time. And once we get a leveling off of our weight, we could then calculate how much water moves through this membrane per pressure, per meter squared of a membrane, per hour, per bar. Then we look at how well it can, we need to say that it's able to reject a certain size of species. And so we chose gold nanoparticles. You can buy them, and they're very uniformly sized spheres. And also they have the ability to, at around 530 nanometers, to absorb light. And so you can measure what your concentration is in your solution before and after. So you can say definitively, we've rejected 98% of these 40 nanometer gold nanoparticles. This is, using those tools, now we can look at what's the effective strain. When we strain this, at 0, there's no permeability at all. At 10% strain, there's a little bit of permeability, and then by 20% strain, considerable permeability, as well as a loss of rejection. If you look, there are error bars on these. They're just really small here. And then all of a sudden, we have enormous error bars. And this is kind of always a problem, is that when we stretch it at these higher strains, we have just a lot of variation. It's always a struggle. So what's causing that? Well, we started looking at what's the effective thickness on our morphology as well as our performance. And so at 88 nanometers thick of our membrane, we can see this type of morphology. This is after 20% strain. And as we go up in thickness, you see a considerable change around 120 nanometers to 160 nanometers. Not only do we get these crazes more clearly when you're zoomed out, but the zoomed in even, you see different morphology at the surface compared to these larger domains. And so we think that that has quite an important influence. To look at now what the performance of these are, we started looking also at their mechanical properties. What does thickness, are they just stronger and then that's why they perform better, or what's happening? So using this film on water tensile tester that our previous student, Dr. Song Zhang, kind of helped create, we could measure the mechanical properties of these polymers. And we see that around 120 nanometers, just like we saw the change in morphology, we see a change in the mechanical properties as well, where it's becoming a lot more easy to elongate, will elongate a lot further, and it's a much stronger material. Now the performance, we also see that around 120 nanometers, we see this change in slope, where we have a reasonable kind of change in our permeability, and then all of a sudden a very extreme change in permeability. And the reason why we think we were getting such crazy changes in large error bars in our performance is that we were doing a lot of our testing right here, where even just a few nanometers of difference in thickness can make a huge difference in the performance. And that's where we think that our error bars got so big, is because the way we manufacture these things is not fully controlled, and it's easy to have differences of 5 nanometers here or there. But 5 nanometers difference thickness is considerable, 1,000 liters per meter squared per hour per bar. So not only did we look at thickness, we also looked at the molecular weight effect. The low molecular weight, this is 80 kilodalton, it actually didn't craze at all, just formed cracks. Whereas 110K, which was our standard, kind of did form these crazes. And then what happens when you go really high molecular weight? Well, it actually formed shear deformation zones at all, so it didn't have like hardly any permeability. And what we think is going on is pretty clear that it goes through this cracks, craze, shear deformation. At low molecular weight, this one suffers from lack of entanglement, so it cracks and you don't get any craze. At high molecular weight, though, why is it not forming any sort of crazing? We think that it just doesn't form enough, large enough domains. Even though it's a really large polymer, which should form large domains, we didn't see any, and we expect that it's probably kinetically trapped and more difficult for it to rearrange in the drying process, so that it didn't have these phase-separated domains. And then finally, we looked at what happens when we change from a soft PEO block to a hard P2VP block. And you can see this is the polymer I've been showing you before. This TG is around -50 compared to polystyrene, which is TG of 100. And we're going to compare it to essentially something that's got a very similar TG. And this is the difference. It's pretty clear that even though these have the same molecular weight, the same thickness, the PEO is essential. Having that soft seems to be really important. You can also see differences in the mechanical properties as well. This is our PS-PEO compared to our PS-P2VP, and this is polystyrene for comparison. So because we have two glassy polymers in this, it's really acting pretty much just like polystyrene and undergoing shear deformation. So in conclusion, the pore width seems to be dependent. You can control it by the domain of your minor block. And it's about 30 nanometers. Also, you can increase the number of pores by stretching it more. This was a max coverage about 15%. There's definitely a critical thickness that occurs around 120 nanometers where we get changes in morphology, changes in mechanical properties, and change in membrane performance. And unfortunately for us, this type of behavior is really only limited to a very narrow window of molecular weights, which is unfortunate because it would be great if we could use lower molecular weight polymers so we can make smaller domains and we could filter smaller things. But really, the amount that we can play with molecular weight is pretty narrow, so the size of things we can filter is pretty narrow. Okay, but how does this compare to normal membranes? So I showed you before, this was the Russell group. They had a permeability of 450 liters per meter squared per hour per bar, with about 99% rejection of 30 nanometer diameter things. That's pretty good. Hillmeyer, he then kind of improved the process, but the performance was maybe a little bit less. And then ours was considerably better, at least in terms of permeability, and still good rejection, although admittedly we were rejecting larger materials. So I would say overall pretty comparable, and we were able to do this with a much faster, scalable process of cavitation. But that's not totally honest. If you can look at this thing, which is what we were trying to break, this barrier, we're still pretty far away from breaking this barrier. We outperform some commercial membranes, but honestly there's still some traditional membranes that are outperforming us. It's understandable they've been kind of optimized for 60 years, but we need to improve performance on this to break this barrier still. And there's a couple ways to do that. First of all, we could decrease the pore variation. See, there's kind of some larger pores. This would be where annealing would come in to make sure all the pores are the same size. That would help us with our selectivity. There's also increased porosity is what we could do. I mean, really, we're only taking advantage of 15% of our actual membrane surface because we're only getting flow through these areas. So changing things like the strain rate, as well as looking into biaxial stretching, could really increase the amount of coverage of these pores. And finally, we need to demonstrate scalability. I said we wanted to create a scalable process, and then I went to making a batch process. The idea was that they've shown people can coat really easily to make these types of composite membranes. That's pretty easy to do scalable. We've actually done it scalably. We can coat our membrane and to create roll-to-roll coated surface. The tricky part is trying to figure out how to turn those into pores really quickly. And so that's what we were focusing on, is trying to figure out. And we think that if we could, once we now know that strain and how it is affected, if we could add some way to add stretching to this roll-to-roll coater, that would really demonstrate the scalability. So that's my presentation, and I would like to thank so many people. But again, first and foremost, Gu, it's been a pleasure working with you. As well as everyone in the GU research group for not only all of your help with presentations and research, but the camaraderie and being there for me. My committee members, I'm so happy that you guys were able to, all in the last minute, be able to push this back. But in addition, Dr. Naz, Dr. Patton, Dr. Wiggins, Dr. Morgan, all of you kind of, I got to know pretty well, and I'm really pleased and happy to be one of your students. It's my family. I'm so happy that you came here. I got to see this, even though it was an hour late. My dad, Mark, my sister, Katie, and my mom, Susie. Yeah, this is. I'm just really happy I get to share this with you. Yeah. And finally, the USM staff, everyone here that works. I've really loved working at USM. Really loved Hattiesburg, and especially Jody, who is acting kind of as secretary for our group, as well as Michael Blanton, who was helpful with the SEM. Thank you to everyone, and also to my funding sources who help pay for all these things. So with that, yeah, let's hear some questions.
Well, excellent talk. Then let's have some question to entertain them. Russ, you go first. Anyone have a question?
So whoever's on here.
Okay, here we have Mark.
Great talk, Daniel. What were the size of the domains and rings before destruction?
Yeah, they were variable. Like I showed, there were some larger ones, but on average, they were around 40 nanometers or so. Yeah. Actually, yeah.
You alluded to this later, but I was curious what strain rate you used and if you looked at the radiation strain rate anyone?
Yeah, I really wish I would have, because depending on how fast you're going to change it should change it quite a bit. I kept it at 1 millimeter per second because that was nice and even. But yeah, going faster, I think you would get potentially more crazes. Yeah.
Great job on your presentation.
Oh, thank you.
My question is, in regards to your second part, what kind of tape is probably necessary in order to induce porosity? How can you ensure that the cavity can heat? Is the polymer robust enough such that cavitation will eventually lead to strain, right?
Yeah, so a lot of those graphs I showed you of the mechanical properties, it breaks around 5% strain when we do it without any support at all. So very early in the strain it would break, but we stretch these things unsupported up to 20% strain, and they were able to withstand that without breaking completely. So having them on support makes a big difference. And so we were able to stretch it as far as possible before our support structure would actually rupture. So potentially we could, if we found a different support structure, we'd actually stretch these even further. And so we didn't actually see that there was a problem with stretching it too far. There is the question though of, if you make these very, very thin films on top, are they going to break when you put them under high pressure? And so that's something to be considerate of.
Great talk. I had a question about your first project that you presented. You showed that as you stretch the different polymers, you measure the percent crystallinity. And I noticed you had a very dramatic difference in the decrease in crystallinity between the natural rubber and the cross-linked forming. Is that just due to the nature of the cross-links, or is some other phenomena that explain how that can be?
Yeah, so it's tough to say for certain, but when you have the physical crosslinks, we saw that the chains are much slower to reorganize. And actually, we saw with the wax data as well that the amorphous chains are slower to reorganize. So during stretch, you need your chains to align with stretch and become next to each other to crystallize. So the ones that had less hindrance, they could align faster and easier, and they would crystallize stronger. Yeah.
And can you speak to the loss in crystallinity as the stress was removed?
Yeah, that's an interesting point. So as you release the stress, there's no longer, all of a sudden your entropy type of, entropy effects come back into play. When you stretch it, all of the force of entropy kind of goes, the hurdle of crystallization due to entropy goes away. So there's some, I'm not explaining this super well, I know, but as you crystallize, it needs to have a certain amount of, a low enough entropy that it can crystallize. And depending on if you have strain or not, that entropy changes. So it can crystallize at room temperature or not. Yeah. Sorry, I know that was bad.
Really interesting research. I was interested, did you try any like multi-axial stretching or biaxial stretching to see if you could use smaller strings and then different directions to try to get more uniform sort of pulls?
I would like to. Yeah, that's the way that the commercial membranes like Gore-Tex are made. It's all biaxial stretching. And so that would be great to do. It's kind of a complex process to do. We don't have that kind of technique. We made that linear extension stage ourselves, so it's not like as straightforward. We have to buy something pretty expensive to do that. But I think that that would definitely increase the amount of craze and performance of the membranes.
Do you think that you could do subsequent?
So
you do one direction once and then change, the different direction of your stretching?
yeah, that should, I think that could work, yeah.
Thanks, great talk.
Any question from faculty?
I'll ask one.
All right.
Carly, here you go. I got a good chance to work on thermoplastic elastomers.
Oh, good.
Would you go to 25?
Yeah.
Yeah. Curious question. You're seeing in your hysteresis, you're seeing quite a bit of hysteresis in that loop, and I noticed others slapped around it. So
Yeah.
any of these block copolymers or EDA or the multi-block elastomers that you can also have, the ABN multi-block,
Yeah.
they always show hysteresis. Artificial heart, a really good example. After you go through the first hysteresis loop, if you go through a second or third, do you lose that?
Yeah, so the first one is always kind of the largest hysteresis step. After you do the first one, you get less and less hysteresis, but we saw that when we did multiple steps that the hysteresis remained there. It was less though. So I don't have a great answer to how that compares to a cross-link rubber.
My curious question is, you also have beautiful data that show what has happened to the changes in X-ray.
Yeah, we're an overkill on it, definitely.
So you can look at that in moments of time, but during the kinetics of the stretch and relaxation, that's really important in your first part of your presentation. So when you get to the second part of your presentation, when you're putting this on the surface, I'm not sure what you're meaning by cavitation. I mean, you see different things with fluid, polymers, and solution, but that is affecting your final pores, just what they look like, morphology. What does this relaxation time and this hysteresis and the amount of time that you got between application of that top surface going to have with your rejection and all of that? I mean, it seems like that'd be very important with these kinds of block copolymers that you're looking at.
Yeah.
Polyethylene oxide, soft ones that you.
Yeah.
Where I'm sure that these are longer.
So we never measured it with an X-ray the stretching of our top surface of our membrane. That was polystyrene predominantly with the polyethylene oxide. That one we never really got to see or measure hysteresis at all. So I think there wouldn't be much hysteresis because I don't think it would come back. I think it's just going to be plastically deformed in that case because there's going to be, it's a thermoplastic, not elastomer, just a thermoplastic. The one with the PSPEO is just a dye block, so there's no physical crosslinks in that one.
So your beautiful apparatus that you propose there, where you're going to use a coating application
Yeah.
to change the rate at which you're putting this on to look at how that affects the pores. You think that would be something you need to look at?
I'm sorry, I didn't catch that.
Relaxation times.
The relaxation
Passes
time.
I'm getting back and what I'm dragging back.
Our surface of our membranes is actually glassy, so it shouldn't have any recovery. For the first half of it was the elastomer, the soft. The second half of the membranes was actually this glassy coating. So in that case, yeah, we didn't measure it for hysteresis because it's not an elastomer. Yeah.
Great presentation.
Thank you.
Enjoy it.
Any other questions?
I'll ask one, Cheyenne, before committee. I enjoyed your talk, Daniel.
Oh, thank you.
I'm always looking for you guys to teach us something. I learned a lot today. I learned you don't like Tommy.
Yeah. Who does? Yeah. There's always one.
I learned a lot. Thank you very much. Slide 27, please.
Yeah.
Yes, on your crystalline alignment on the lower left there, that big jump.
Yeah.
That was here. Tell us physically what's going on there and what is that result? I think.
Yeah, sure. So that's a good question. So as you're stretching these things, all of your amorphous chains are aligning, but up until about 100% strain, they're not aligned enough to actually turn into a crystal. And so around 100% strain, you get to this point where I think I showed on the previous section that that's where the strain-induced crystallization occurs. So all of a sudden, all of these aligned amorphous chains are rapidly crystallizing. And so you see this enormous jump because all your chains are already kind of right there. They just need to click into crystalline form. Yep.
Okay. If there's no more questions, let's thank Daniel for the great presentation. Now I'm going to go into the next session will be a close the door committee discussion. So thanks everybody for attending.
All right. I'll see you guys soon.
Thanks for being here. Be real proud of it.
Honor the first one.
Thank you.
Congratulations.
Oh, come here. How are you? Thank you. Good job. Thanks. Thanks. Great job, buddy. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Congratulations.
Thank you. Come here.
So good.
Hey, I almost say, wait, I give one thing. Hey, listen, good job, man.
Hey,
I
thanks.
enjoyed that.
Yeah,
That was
yeah.
great stuff.
Thank you for coming. I really
Yeah.
appreciate it. All right, look, I'm hugging everyone now, so you made it. Hey, thank
Great job.
Okay.
See you soon.
Yes, yes, come here.
Good stuff.
Dude, my guy. I'm so glad you gotta be here, man. Oh shit, well,